Welcome to Shalom Media.
An environment is a system of living things. The Earth is our environment. The capacity of our environment to provide space, to produce food, and to supply energy are all limited. Humans thrive on less than 17% of the Earth's surface, and only about 4% will grow crops. We depend on these limited resources for our survival. Yet we are increasing our population as if they were infinite. This fact is at the core of our environmental problems. On this map, we'll show population growth from the year 1 CE to the present, and project our growth into the year 2050. Population concentrations will be indicated by dots, each of which will represent 1 million people. In areas where people are spread out and don't live in concentrations of 1 million, dots are placed in the middle of their approximate range. Historical references will be provided by images and text at the bottom of the screen. Our population is expected to grow to 10 billion by the end of this century. Yet the Earth's size remains the same. Slowing human population growth and lowering our use of natural resources are key to reducing the impact we have on the planet. Through the decisions we make about our lifestyles, our numbers, and our consumption, we can all help preserve the health and beauty of our home.
Deniers believe global warming is a hoax. It's the liberals complaining. Business as usual is just fine. The Al Gore crowd sees climate change as real. Humans are the cause. But it's not that urgent. Minor tweaks to the marketplace can fix this. Group 3 says markets cannot fix the problem. Positive feedback will rapidly transform our planet. The consequences will be severe. 3 incompatible views. How did we get here? In the 1960s, the men and women who ended fascism on 2 continents during World War II reached middle age. They looked around to find people being beaten in the streets, severe environmental degradation, and kids coming home from foreign wars in body bags. In response, they elected a Congress that passed a huge amount of progressive legislation. Many of these new laws reduced the rate at which rich people could get richer. To counter these setbacks, on August 23, 1971, Lewis Powell wrote a memo in which he urged businessmen to pool a lot of money and change the attitudes and beliefs of Americans. Every year since then, billions have flowed to think tanks to create pro-corporate mythology and to purchase media to spread these ideas. As part of this effort, Big Energy has invested less than a penny per dollar of profit to move folks from Group 3 to the Al Gore crowd to the deniers. As a result, every effort to cut greenhouse gas emissions has been stalemated, and roughly half of all Americans believe global warming is a fraud. Is climate change real? How can we know? From antibiotics to skyscrapers, planes to DVDs, computers to plastics, science has delivered all the technologic wonders we take for granted today. So what does science tell us? In 1978, we launched a satellite. Part of its mission was to measure Arctic ice. This is 35 years of daily ice sheet volume measurements in thousands of cubic kilometers. How do you measure ice volume from orbit? Ice is less dense than water. When floating, part of it sits above water. The satellite sends out a pulse and measures the time until the reflection returns. Because it knows its altitude precisely, it can determine the height of the ice and thus thickness. To make trends easy to see, only yearly maximum, average, and minimum volume are shown here. Extending the minimum curve, we find an ice-free Arctic for a few days as early as September 2016. We also have 35 years of Arctic ice area data. We can divide volume by area to obtain average thickness. The red line is 3 feet. Thickness is declining 4 times faster than area. Area will remain high until thickness drops to 0 and the entire ice sheet suddenly disappears. Looking at volume trends, Arctic ice will be gone for a few September days, no later than 2020. Following the maximum trend curve, the Arctic will be ice-free permanently in 2032. However, with additional positive feedback taking hold, the Arctic could be ice-free as early as 2025. Positive feedback is a situation where the output of a system also acts as an input, such that a change in the output causes the output to change further and faster in the direction it was going. More than 30 positive feedback mechanisms documented in the scientific literature are starting to speed up climate change. This is commercial shipping today in the Arctic. Where are we in relation to the tipping point? August 1958, the USS Nautilus finds average ice thickness to be 3.08 meters, 10.1 feet. When the Queenfish retraced this journey in 1970, it found thickness had declined to 2.39 meters, 7.8 feet. Were 1958 and 1970 above or below average thickness years? This is the satellite data for the month of August with its trend curve. Maximum deviation from trend is 0.274 meters. We can add and subtract this from the submarine data to obtain a likely range for the satellite data. The upper edge of this gray area slopes downward. This means during the 1960s, when carbon dioxide was only 320 parts per million, the Arctic ice sheet was quietly but relentlessly melting away. For the past few million years, we have bounced between ice ages and interglacial periods. Like it or not, we are already on our way to a hotter temperature state. How does one obtain temperature from thousands or millions of years ago to produce this history? Note the delta oxygen 18 reference at the right-hand edge. Oxygen has 3 stable isotopes. Oxygen 16 has 8 protons and 8 neutrons for an atomic weight of 16. Oxygen 18 has 10 neutrons, giving it an atomic weight of 18. Being heavier, an oxygen 18 water molecule is less likely to evaporate than an oxygen 16 molecule. However, the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 evaporated increases with temperature. When oceans are warmer, more oxygen 18 water evaporates. Ice cores and other land sediments have a higher oxygen 18 concentration. When more oxygen 18 evaporates, calcium carbonate shells from marine creatures falling to the ocean floor contain less oxygen 18. When temperature is lower, less oxygen 18 evaporates. Land-based sediments contain less oxygen 18, while marine sediments contain more. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, CO2 was 280 parts per million. Since 1800, excess CO2 in the air has doubled every 32 years. The zigzag is Keeling's CO2 measurements at Mauna Loa. Today, CO2 is at 400 parts per million, a 120 part per million excess over 280, and 3 times the 1960s 40 ppm surplus. If business as usual continues, we will hit 520 ppm by 2046 and 760 ppm by 2078. Climate change activists say we must bring CO2 back down to 350 parts per million by 2050 at the latest. If 320 parts per million was enough to melt the Arctic, how will getting back to 350 parts per million do anything, especially if the Arctic ice sheet no longer reflects sunlight during summer months? We are past the tipping point. Why are so few Americans aware of this? Why do so few care? The answer is the success of the Powell letter-induced disinformation campaign. When the Arctic ice sheet is gone, climate change will shift from gradual to rapid. The 5th IPCC report places the heating imbalance at 2.29 watts per square meter. Multiplying this times the area of the Earth gives a total heating imbalance of 1.17 petawatts. The Earth receives 174 petawatts of power from the Sun. Currently, it radiates only 173 petawatts back into space. This roughly 1 petawatt difference is heating our planet. When the Arctic transforms from reflecting sunlight to an open water solar collector, another petawatt of heating imbalance will be added. What are the consequences? Greenland's ice will raise sea level 23 feet. A petawatt of heat dumped into the Arctic is enough to melt this ice in 25 years. In the last ice age, sea level dropped 400 feet. In a hotter state, where Antarctica also melts, and with thermal expansion, sea level will rise 300 feet. The areas in blue show dry land during an ice age. Areas in red are underwater in a hotter state. As the last ice age ended, it took roughly 8,000 years for the ice to melt to its present level. The remaining ice will melt in under 1,000 years. The climate system that carries rainwater over the continents is driven by the 80-degree Fahrenheit difference between the equator and the North Pole. When the Arctic is ice-free year-round, this difference drops to 45 degrees. The strength of the winds will decline, producing less rainwater and a permanent mega-drought. Estimates of human population by the end of this century place our numbers well below 1 billion. The Powell letter campaign for corporate dominance has concentrated power in America. This shows the wealth required to be person 400 on the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, divided by median household income. Over 32 years, the purchasing power of median household income has stagnated, while rich people have seen their purchasing power triple. In the 1980s or 90s, we could have climbed back up the cliff. Because rich people did not yet have enough money, paradise will transform to desert. The book covers far more material and in far greater detail. I need your assistance to deliver it into the marketplace of ideas. Thank you. If this video has been helpful, please click thumbs up, subscribe, and share the link with friends.
The ocean keeps secrets. Hidden beneath its waves are worlds within worlds. Over billions of years, the ocean has created endless varieties of life. Life that enchants us, that sustains us. And despite our science, life that mystifies us still.
The oceans are an incredible place, full of the most amazing kinds of life. Life that you could never imagine really working. Things that if somebody just thought of them and showed them to you, you'd think, that's ridiculous. Nothing like that could ever live. But it does.
In 35 years of diving, it's quite a picture. I've spent my life on the bottom of the ocean with black sea bass. I've seen white sharks underwater. I've been in schools of bait that would be so big that they will dark out the sun. I can only hope that the ocean maintains that vitality. It's an incredible place of mystery, and it's something that's beautiful beyond description.
People rely on the oceans in so many ways. Some ways are obvious, like food, recreation, transportation.
They clean our shores. They protect our coastlines from storms.
The oceans regulate climate and provide the world with most of its oxygen.
But we are now certain of one awesome fact. The ocean's power to create life is rivaled by our own power to destroy it. Scientists refer to ocean acidification as the other carbon problem. The first, of course, is global warming.
People have heard about global warming for years, but it's only over the past 5 years that experts really understood that the carbon dioxide is causing a problem for the oceans as well. And what's worrisome is it hasn't even been on our radar.
Carbon dioxide pollution is transforming the chemistry of the ocean, rapidly making the water more acidic. In decades, rising ocean acidity may challenge life on a scale that has not occurred for tens of millions of years. So we confront an urgent choice: to move beyond fossil fuels, or to risk turning the ocean into a sea of weeds.
When we burn coal, oil, or gas, we introduce carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the atmosphere touches the ocean over 70% of Earth's surface. So this carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, we are also putting into the ocean.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2, exists naturally in our atmosphere. Plants need it to grow. Animals exhale it in every breath. But carbon dioxide is also a byproduct of burning fossil fuels. And in large amounts, it is a dangerous pollutant. Since the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has absorbed roughly 1/4 of the carbon dioxide produced by burning fuels. Scientists once thought this beneficial. After all, that carbon dioxide would otherwise accelerate global warming. But what happens when so much carbon dioxide, 22 million tons of it each day, mixes with ocean water? In terms of chemistry, the answer is simple. It becomes an acid.
Since the Industrial Revolution, the ocean acidity is increased by 30%. With mathematical models, scientists have demonstrated that if we continue to pollute as we are now, the ocean acidity will double by the end of the century compared to pre-industrial times. That is a big problem.
Scientists only recently stopped to think about what this would mean for life in the ocean. Thousands of ocean species build protective shells to survive. Some are so prolific, they can be seen from space. These organisms create their shells, which can be paper thin, by drawing certain molecules from the water around them. But rising acidity depletes those molecules.
So by removing the essential building block for shell formation, it's making the organisms work a lot harder to build their shells, and that means they have less energy to get food, they have less energy to reproduce, and eventually the organism can no longer compete ecologically. The surprise is how sensitive some marine organisms are to this increased acidity from carbon dioxide.
And when acidity gets too high, shells dissolve.
We're changing the basic rules of everything. And because of that, a lot of organisms may not be able to survive.
Already, we've seen water showing up off the coast of Northern California that's acidic enough to start actually dissolving seashells. It's thought that this kind of corrosive water showing up will become more and more common.
Most of the west coast of North America's shellfish, that's Dungeness crabs, lobsters, mussels, oysters, sea urchins, shrimp, all those life forms are at risk.
By mid-century, if we continue emitting carbon dioxide the way we have been, entire vast areas of both the Southern Ocean and the Arctic Ocean will be so corrosive that it will cause seashells to dissolve.
Scientific models show that in just a few decades, we will profoundly alter the ocean's chemistry. Such conditions haven't existed since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Recreating those conditions so quickly could leave many ocean animals unable to adapt. What if shellfish could no longer build shells? Would they cease to exist? Perhaps. Shelled creatures such as corals and plankton play a key role in the ocean food web. Pteropods are a kind of plankton that live all around the world and in great abundance in polar waters. Pteropods are especially vulnerable.
Okay. Should I focus in that?
Yeah,
right in there.
We're looking at pteropod shells, which are planktonic snails with a calcium carbonate shell that we collected from Antarctica this past winter. And you can see it looks like there's this lip where it may have already started to dissolve and kind of curled over, because that's what it looks like when it dissolves. It kind of melts, almost like a candle and wax melting. The shell thickness along the leading edge right here is less than 1 micrometer thick. These are the thinnest pteropod shells I've ever seen.
There's growing alarm that higher acidity will extinguish creatures like pteropods that are a basic food source for fish. In many parts of the world, fish are a basic food source for people.
So you can't just worry about the big things in the ocean, you have to worry about what they eat and where their food comes from. If the smallest things in the ocean are affected by ocean acidification, then it ripples all the way up the food web, making the largest things in the ocean even more in danger.
As individual strands disappear, the entire food web becomes weaker, more vulnerable, less beneficial to humankind.
And many of us are concerned about what that means for the Earth's marine ecosystems, but also for the many millions of people that depend on these systems for their food and income.
Ocean acidity will rise most quickly in cold water regions and areas where deep water wells up to the surface.
That is disconcerting because it coincides with the regions of the most productive fisheries in the world.
I'm a fisherman. Every single day, I have to make a prediction where I'm going to go fishing, whether I'm going to find fish where I go. And every single day, the decisions I make the difference between whether I stay a fisherman and make a profit. I can make predictions. I think these things are dire problems. Either we change what we're doing on land, or it will have profound effects on fisheries as we know them.
Marine life that might withstand warming temperatures or rising acidity may succumb when confronted by both. Coral reefs already struggle to survive in warming waters. Rising ocean acidity puts them in double jeopardy.
We know that coral reefs are particularly sensitive to ocean acidification, and the reason for that is that corals are unable to form their skeletons as quickly as they used to, and reefs are starting to crumble and disappear. We may lose those ecosystems within 20 or 30 years. And in those structures live an estimated 1 million species. 1 in every 4 species in the ocean lives on a coral reef. We've got the last decade in which we can do something about this problem. But it's very, very clear that if we don't start to deal with it right now with very, very stern cuts to emissions, we are going to condemn oceans to an extremely uncertain future.
We're really in the last decades of coral reefs on this planet for at least the next, say, 1,000,000+ years, unless we do something very soon to reduce CO2 emissions. We're moving from a world of rich biological diversity into essentially a world of weeds.
Today we're in a really remarkable history of the ocean. 100 years ago it was inexhaustible. You couldn't touch it, you couldn't harm it. In 100 years, it might be dead.
When people say it was high CO2 100 million years ago, so we have nothing to worry about, that high CO2 was achieved over a slow process of millions of years. And if we achieve high CO2 over millions of years, the Earth will be able to handle it. If we achieve high CO2 over decades, the ocean is in big trouble.
Earth is the only planet we know of where life exists. To understand our own actions, we sometimes need to view them in a larger context. Planet Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. 3.5 billion years ago, life began. 250 million years ago, dinosaurs appeared. And 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. Within that framework, human civilization is brand new. Our industrial society, but an instant. Yet in that instant, we have altered the course of nature. We have heated the Earth's surface, acidified its oceans, and consumed much of its natural habitat. Now, something extraordinary looms. A mass extinction of animals and plants, caused not by volcanic eruption or the collision of a meteor, but by the actions of one species, ours.
If we destroy these ecosystems, it will take millions of years for them to recover. It's as if somebody, just because they had the ability to do it, decided to run through the Metropolitan Museum with a knife, slashing the great paintings of the world.
We have created this problem. We should be able to solve it. The ocean, after all, is resilient. Given the chance and enough time, it can heal itself. So how can we give the ocean that chance? Marine protected areas, like national parks in the sea, shelter ocean life from industry and development. Sustainable fishing practices allow fish stocks to regenerate. The ocean can better defend itself against rising acidity and temperature if its systems are healthy.
To make the oceans more resilient to these changes, we need to do a better job at keeping the oceans healthy. That means restoring depleted fish populations, establishing marine protected areas all around the globe, and reducing pollution, particularly nutrient pollution, in the coastal zones.
Solving those local problems gives those ecosystems a chance to survive, a chance to make it through while we solve the global problem. We know how to solve the local problems of marine ecosystem health. We know how to solve the global problems. The question is, will we?
The only way to stop acidification is to emit less carbon dioxide. Our Industrial Revolution began more than 2 centuries ago. Technology has advanced rapidly since then, but we still make energy as we have for hundreds of thousands of years, by setting things on fire. Often, we squander the energy we make, using more than necessary to accomplish our goals. But now we know how to use energy more efficiently, how to do more with less.
There was a time when people thought about energy efficiency and conservation as sacrifice, doing without, dark homes, shuttered economies. That is emphatically not what we're talking about. We're talking about getting dramatically more work out of less energy with better technology. Those energy efficiency solutions are particularly promising because the whole world will want to adopt them. If we take that initial step, we will also, in addition to reducing carbon pollution, have the very welcome dividend in the form of economic stimulus because we'll be reducing energy bills.
We know how to capture energy cleanly from sunlight, wind, tides, and the heat of the Earth's core.
Imagine that you're living in a house that gets some of its electricity from its own solar panels, feeds some of that back into your own vehicle when it's plugged in at night, provides you with energy services, and maybe this is the most important single piece of it, at costs below those you're paying now. That double dividend was never more needed by the U.S. and world economy than it is right now.
We are on the verge of a green industrial revolution, a revolution that will expand our economy, protect our resources, and give us real energy independence.
There is much we don't know about how carbon pollution will affect our world. Still, we have to choose. We can go on as we have, forcing future generations to survive somehow without the vast ocean resources that have sustained us. Or we can move beyond fossil fuels, securing a future that works for all of us, for all living things. What will we choose?
You're not going to use this, I'm going to just say it though. What makes a Greek tragedy is that you can see it coming. Oedipus, goes and marries his mother and eventually tears his eyes out, and you want to tell him, look, no, don't marry your mother. You can stop this process now.
And you think, if I could only go back and change that one little tiny instant, then things would have been different. I think we're in that instant right now.
We sit by feeling almost helpless because we see this unraveling leading to its tragic end. Researchers
are predicting significant and substantial changes in the next 2 decades to our oceans. So it is not necessarily a problem we're passing off to future generations. It's a problem that we're generating for ourselves.
I think what gets me up in the morning is that I don't want to see coral reefs disappear on my watch. And I know that my fellow scientists feel this way as well. So we feel compelled to communicate the message that this is a serious issue and that changes that haven't happened for millions of years are starting to happen right before our eyes. I think it's important to point out that it's not all over yet.
I don't expect people to understand what pteropods are or what various forms of plankton are likely to survive or not survive. But I do expect our policymakers to take serious an issue that is so closely tied to life on this planet and the future of life on this planet. I have hope. You can't fish and not have hope.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to have a chance just to meet with you and talk about some of the problems that we're facing. Now, some of these problems are local, some are national, some are global, but they're all tied together. They're tied together with arithmetic, and the arithmetic isn't very difficult. And what I hope to do is I hope to be able to convince you that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. So you say, well, what's the exponential function? This is a mathematical function that you would write down if you're going to describe the size of anything that was growing steadily. If you had something growing 5% per year, you'd write the exponential function to show how large that growing quantity was year after year. And so we're talking about a situation where the time that's required for the growing quantity to increase by a fixed fraction is a constant. 5% per year, the 5% is a fixed fraction, the per year is a fixed length of time. Now that's what we want to talk about, it's ordinary steady growth. Well, if it takes a fixed length of time to grow 5%, it follows it takes a longer fixed length of time to grow 100%. Now that longer time is called a doubling time. We need to know how you calculate the doubling time, and it's easy. You just take the number 70, divide it by the percent growth per unit time, and that gives you the doubling time. So our example of 5% per year, you divide the 5 into 70, you find that growing quantity will double in size every 14 years. Well, you might ask, where did the 70 come from? The answer is it's approximately 100 multiplied by the natural logarithm of 2. If you wanted the time to triple, you'd use the natural logarithm of 3. So it's all very logical. But you don't have to remember where it came from if you'll just remember 70. Now, I wish we could get every person to make this mental calculation every time we see a percent growth rate of anything in a news story. For example, if you saw a story that said things have been growing 7% per year for several recent years, you wouldn't bat an eyelash. But when you see a headline that says crime has doubled in a decade, you say, my heavens, what's happening? Well, what is happening? 7% growth per year. Divide the 7 into 70, the doubling time is 10 years. But notice, if you're going to write a headline, you never write crime growing 7% per year because most people wouldn't know what it really means. Now, do you know what 7% really means? Let's take another example from Colorado. The cost of an all-day lift ticket to ski at Vail has been growing about 7% per year ever since Vail first opened in 1963, and at that time you paid $5 for an all-day lift ticket. Now, what's the doubling time for 7% growth? 10 years. So what was the cost 10 years later in 1973? 10 years later in 1983? 10 years later in 1993? And what do we have to look forward to? Now, this is what 7% means. Most people don't have a clue. Well, let's look at a generic graph of something that's growing steadily. After one doubling time, the growing quantity is up to twice its initial size. 2 doubling times, it's up to 4 times its initial size. Then it goes to 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. In just 10 doubling times, it's 1,000 times larger than when it started. And you can see If you tried to make a graph of that on ordinary graph paper, the graph will go right through the ceiling. Now let me give you an example to show the enormous numbers you get with just a modest number of doublings. Legend has it that the game of chess was invented by a mathematician who worked for a king. The king was very pleased. He said, "I want to reward you." And the mathematician said, "My needs are modest. Please take my new chessboard and on the first square place 1 grain of wheat. On the next square double the 1 to make 2. On the next square double the 2 to make 4. Just keep doubling till you've doubled for every square. That will be an adequate payment." Well, we can guess the king thought, "This foolish man. I was ready to give him a real reward. All he asked for is just a few grains of wheat." Well, let's see what's involved in this. We note there are 8 grains on the 4th square. Now I can get this number 8 by multiplying 3 2's together. It's 2 times 2 times 2. It's 1 2 less than the number of the square. Now that follows in each case. So on the last square, I'd find the number of grains by multiplying 63 2's together. Now let's look at the way the totals build up. When we have 1 grain on the first square, the total on the board is 1. We add 2 grains, that makes a total 3. We put on 4 grains, now the total is 7. 7 is a grain less than 8. It's a grain less than 3 2's multiplied together. 15 is a grain less than 4 2's multiplied together. Well, that continues in each case. So when we're done, the total number of grains will be 1 grain less than the number I get multiplying 64 2's together. And my question is, how much wheat is that? You know, would that be a nice pile here in the studio? Would it fill the building? Would it cover the county to a depth of 2 meters? How much wheat are we talking about? The answer is it's roughly 400 times the 1990 worldwide harvest of wheat. Now that could be more wheat than humans have harvested in the entire history of the earth. And you say, how'd you get such a big number? Well, it was simple. We just started with 1 grain, but we let the number grow steadily till it had doubled a mere 63 times. There's something else that's very important. The growth in any doubling time is greater than the total of all of the preceding growth. For example, when we put 8 grains on the 4th square, the 8 is larger than the total of 7 that were already there. When we put 32 grains on the 6th square, the 32 is larger than the total of 31 that were already there. Every time the growing quantity doubles, it takes more than all that you'd used in all of the preceding growth. Now, let's translate that into the energy crisis. Here's an ad from the year 1975, and it asks the question, could America run out of electricity? America depends on electricity. Our need for electricity actually doubles every 10 or 12 years. That's an accurate reflection of a very long history of steady growth of the electric industry in this country, growth at a rate of around 7% per year, which goes with doubling every 10 years. Now, with all that history of growth, they expected the growth would just go on forever. Fortunately, it stopped. Not because anyone understood the arithmetic, it stopped for other reasons. But let's ask, what if? Suppose the growth had continued. Then we would see here the thing that we just saw on the chessboard. In the 10 years following the appearance of this ad, in that decade, the amount of electrical energy that we would have consumed in this country would have been greater than the total of all of the electrical energy we had ever consumed in the entire preceding history of the steady growth of that industry in this country. Now, did you realize that anything as completely acceptable as 7% growth per year could give such an incredible consequence that in just 10 years you'd use more than the total of all that had been used in all of preceding history? Well, that's exactly what President Carter was referring to in his famous speech on energy. One of his statements was this. He said, and in each of those decades, more oil was consumed than in all of mankind's previous history. Now, by itself, that's a stunning statement. Now you can understand it. The President was telling us a simple consequence of the arithmetic of 7% growth each year in world oil consumption, and that was the historic figure up until the 1970s. Now there's another beautiful consequence of this arithmetic. If you take 70 years as a period of time, and note that that's roughly one human lifetime, then any percent growth continued steadily for 70 years gives you an overall increase by a factor that's very easy to calculate. For example, 4% per year You find the factor by multiplying 4 2's together, it's a factor of 16. Now, a few years ago, one of the newspapers here in Boulder quizzed the 9 members of the Boulder City Council and asked them, what rate of growth of Boulder's population do you think it would be good to have in the coming years? Now, the 9 members of the Boulder City Council gave answers ranging from a low of 1% per year. Now, that happens to match the present rate of growth of the population of the United States. We are not at 0 population growth. Right now, the number of Americans is increasing by more than 3 million people every year. No member of the City Council said Boulder should grow less rapidly than the United States is growing. Now, the highest answer any council member gave was 5% per year. Well, you know, I felt compelled. I had to write them a letter and say, did you know that 5% growth for just 70, I can remember when 70 years used to seem like an awful long time. It doesn't seem so long now. Well, that means Boulder's population would increase by a factor of 32. That is where today we have 1 overloaded sewer treatment plant. In 70 years, we'd need 32 overloaded sewer treatment plants. Now, did you realize that anything as completely all-American as 5% growth per year could give such an incredible consequence in such a modest period of time? Our city council people had 0 understanding of this very simple arithmetic.